A quiet return. The sun dipped low over the small Midwestern town of Birchwood, casting long shadows across the wheat fields that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. Ethan Blake stood at the edge of his family's farm, leaning against the weathered wooden fence that had seen better days. The warm hues of the sunset painted his face, but his piercing gray eyes carried a storm that the peaceful surroundings couldn't calm. This was his first week home after a long and grueling deployment as a Navy SEAL. Ethan had left Birchwood 8 years ago, chasing a purpose he believed couldn't be found in the quiet monotony of farm life. The Navy gave him that purpose and more. It gave him discipline, camaraderie, and the ability to handle the unimaginable. But it also took its toll, leaving scars he carried deep within. Returning home wasn't just a physical journey. It was a desperate attempt to piece himself back together in the simplicity of his roots. The farm hadn't changed much since he left. His father, Frank Blake, still worked tirelessly to keep it running despite his advancing age. The barn needed a new coat of paint, the fences leaned precariously, and the tractor seemed to be held together by sheer willpower. But this land wasn't just a livelihood. It was the heart of the Blake family. Ethan's mother had passed away years ago, and the farm was all Frank had left to keep her memory alive. Ethan's quiet contemplation was interrupted by the distant rumble of a motorcycle engine. He glanced down the dirt road leading to the farmhouse and spotted a figure riding up, dust swirling in their wake. His grip on the fence tightened instinctively, a habit born of years in dangerous territories. But as the bike drew closer, he recognized the rider, Cassie Bennett, a childhood friend who now owned the Birchwood Diner. Ethan, Cassie called as she pulled up and swung off the bike. Her auburn hair was tied back in a loose braid, and her warm smile was a welcome contrast to the unease Ethan had carried since his return. "Cassie," Ethan greeted, his voice calm but edged with the tension of someone not yet ready to let their guard down. Cassie studied him for a moment, her smile softening. "It's good to see you back. Everyone in town's been talking about it." Ethan smirked faintly. "Small towns don't keep secrets." "No, they don't." Cassie stepped closer, her tone growing serious. "But some things have changed since you've been gone. The Crimson Vipers moved in about 2 years ago. They've taken over half the town, and most folks are too scared to stand up to them." Ethan frowned, the name unfamiliar. "Crimson Vipers." "Biker gang," Cassie explained. "They started small, just a few guys causing trouble, but they've grown. Now they're extorting businesses, wrecking property, and making it clear they're in charge." Ethan's jaw tightened. "What about the sheriff?" Cassie shook her head. "Sheriff Callahan does what he can, but the Vipers outnumber his deputies, and they're not afraid to retaliate." Ethan felt a flicker of anger ignite deep within him. He had faced far more dangerous enemies in his time, and the thought of his hometown being terrorized by a gang didn't sit well. Still, he'd come back to escape conflict, not dive headfirst into another battle. "I'll keep an eye out," Ethan said cautiously, "but I'm not here to pick fights." Cassie nodded, though her expression showed doubt. "Just be careful, Ethan. They're not the kind of people you want to tangle with." As Cassie rode off, Ethan turned back to the farm, his thoughts heavier than before. The next few days were a blur of hard work, repairing fences, tending to the crops, and reconnecting with his father. Frank was as stubborn as ever, refusing to let Ethan take on too much of the workload. But Ethan noticed the way his father's hands trembled slightly when gripping tools, and how he moved a little slower than he used to. Age was catching up to him. The calm didn't last long. On the third day, Ethan drove into town to pick up supplies. The Birchwood General Store was a relic of simpler times, its shelves stocked with everything from canned goods to farming equipment. As he loaded his truck, he overheard a heated argument near the front counter. "You're late on your payment, Harris," a gruff voice growled. Ethan turned to see a burly man in a leather jacket towering over the store owner, Tom Harris, who looked pale and nervous. I just need a little more time," Tom stammered. "Business has been slow." The biker sneered. "That's not our problem." Crimson wants his cut. You've got till Friday, or this place gets trashed." Ethan's fists clenched involuntarily. He stepped closer, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. "Hey," he called out, his voice steady but commanding. "Leave him alone." The biker turned, his expression shifting from annoyance to amusement. "And who the hell are you?" Ethan didn't blink. "Someone who doesn't like bullies." The room fell silent as the two men squared off. The biker took a step forward, clearly sizing Ethan up. "You must be the Navy guy everyone's talking about. Think you're tough because you've seen some action." Ethan's eyes hardened, but he didn't rise to the bait. "Walk away," he said evenly. "This isn't your fight." The biker snorted, but something in Ethan's unflinching gaze made him hesitate. With a scoff, he turned and stormed out of the store, muttering curses under his breath. Tom exhaled shakily. "Thank you, Ethan. I didn't know what to do." Ethan nodded. "They're just trying to scare you. Don't let them see you panic." As he drove back to the farm, Ethan's mind raced. The Crimson Vipers were more than just a nuisance. They were a threat to everything and everyone he cared about. And whether he wanted to or not, Ethan knew he couldn't sit idly by while his hometown was overrun. The storm was coming, and this time, Ethan would be ready. Rumblings of resistance. The dawn broke over Birchwood with a quiet stillness, the kind that seemed to hold its breath before something big happened. Ethan Blake stood at the edge of the porch, his gaze scanning the horizon where the faint outline of the town's water tower loomed against the early morning sky. His father, Frank, was already at work, tinkering with the aging tractor that had been a thorn in their side for as long as Ethan could remember. Ethan's thoughts lingered on the encounter at the general store. The Crimson Vipers weren't just bullies. They were parasites feeding on the fear of the townsfolk. He had seen their type before in war-torn countries, men who thrived on power and intimidation. Yet Birchwood wasn't a battlefield, and he wasn't here as a soldier. He had come home to heal, not to fight. But some fights come to you whether you're ready or not. As Ethan leaned against the porch railing, his father emerged from the barn, wiping grease off his hands with a tattered rag. "You've been quiet this morning," Frank said, his voice carrying the gruff warmth of a man who had spent a lifetime working the land. Ethan turned to face him, debating whether to share his concerns. "Ran into some trouble in town," he said finally. One of the Vipers was shaking down Tom Harris at the general store. Frank's expression darkened. "Those bastards have been a thorn in everyone's side for years now. They think they own this town." Ethan crossed his arms. "Why hasn't anyone stood up to them?" Frank sighed, leaning against the barn door. "Folks tried it first. The sheriff, a few business owners. But the Vipers don't play fair. They go after families, livelihoods. Most people don't want to risk it." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's exactly why they keep getting away with it." Frank studied his son for a long moment, his eyes reflecting a mix of pride and concern. "You've been through enough, Ethan. Don't go looking for trouble. This farm's seen enough heartbreak." Ethan nodded, though his mind was already turning over possibilities. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him. Later that day, Ethan drove into town again, this time to meet with Cassie. The Birchwood Diner was a relic of another era, its red vinyl booths and checkerboard floors a comforting reminder of simpler times. As Ethan entered, Cassie waved him over from a corner booth where two steaming mugs of coffee waited. "Glad you came," Cassie said, sliding one of the mugs toward him. "Figured we needed to talk," Ethan replied, his tone low. "The Vipers are getting bolder." Cassie nodded, her expression grim. "They've taken over half the businesses in town, Ethan. The only ones still holding out are Tom Harris, old Mr. Leary, and me. But it's only a matter of time before they come for the diner." Ethan took a sip of coffee, his mind racing. "What about the sheriff? Can he do anything?" Cassie shook her head. Sheriff Callahan stretched thin. "He's got 3 deputies and no backup. The Vipers outnumber them 10-1, and they're not afraid to retaliate." Ethan leaned back in the booth, his gaze distant. "What if we didn't wait for the sheriff? Cassie raised an eyebrow. What are you suggesting? Resistance, Ethan said simply. The vipers operate on fear. If we can show them they're not untouchable, the people in this town might find the courage to stand up to them. Cassie frowned. Ethan, this isn't some war zone. These are regular people. They're scared, and they have families to protect. Ethan met her gaze, his expression resolute. I know, but fear only works if it's one-sided. If we fight back, the vipers will have to think twice about who they're messing with. Cassie hesitated, then nodded slowly. All right. What's the plan? Over the next few days, Ethan began reaching out to the townsfolk, starting with those who had already resisted the vipers. Tom Harris, despite his fear, was the first to agree. I'll do whatever I can, he said, his voice trembling but determined. I'm tired of living like this. Old Mr. Leary, the owner of a small hardware store, was next. I've been in this town for 70 years, he said, his weathered face set in a hard line. I'll be damned if I let a bunch of punks run me out. Ethan knew they would need more than courage. He spent hours in the hardware store, buying supplies to fortify key locations in town. He set up a network of communication among the resistors, using burner phones and encrypted apps to keep their plans under wraps. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Cassie took charge of rallying the women in town, many of whom had been silently suffering under the Viper's reign. We're stronger together, she told them. They can't intimidate us all. One evening, as Ethan worked late in the barn repairing an old generator, he heard the rumble of motorcycle engines in the distance. He stepped outside, his sharp eyes scanning the road. The Vipers were approaching, their headlights cutting through the darkness like predators' eyes. Ethan's heart pounded as he realized they were headed straight for the farm. He sprinted to the house, locking the doors and grabbing his father's old hunting rifle. Frank appeared in the hallway, his face pale. They're coming, Ethan said, his voice steady. Get to the basement and stay there. Frank hesitated. Ethan, you can't face them alone. I'm not alone, Ethan replied. I've got the farm, the traps, and the training. Now go. Reluctantly, Frank obeyed, retreating to the basement as Ethan positioned himself by the front door. The Viper's bikes roared into the driveway, their headlights casting eerie shadows across the porch. Crimson, the gang's leader, dismounted and sauntered toward the house, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Evening, Blake, Crimson drawled. Heard you've been stirring up trouble. Ethan stepped onto the porch, his rifle resting casually in his hands. Just protecting what's mine. Crimson chuckled, the sound low and menacing. This farm's been in your family a long time, hasn't it? Shame if something happened to it. Ethan didn't blink. You're not going to scare me off. Crimson. The gang leader's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. You think you're some kind of hero. This isn't a movie, Blake. You step out of line, and people get hurt. Ethan's grip on the rifle tightened. The only people getting hurt are the ones who come onto my land uninvited. For a moment, the two men stood in tense silence, the weight of their unspoken threats hanging heavy in the air. Then Crimson turned to his gang, signaling them to mount their bikes. This isn't over, he said, his voice low and dangerous. We'll be back. As the Vipers roared off into the night, Ethan lowered his rifle, his body still taut with adrenaline. He knew Crimson wasn't bluffing. The fight was just beginning. The first strike. Ethan Blake woke before dawn, the faint chill of the early morning air wrapping around him as he stepped outside. The farm was still, the only sounds the distant hum of crickets and the soft rustle of the wheat fields swaying in the breeze. But the calm was deceptive, masking the growing storm that had been brewing since his return. Crimson's visit the previous night had been a warning, but Ethan wasn't one to cower in the face of threats. He had spent years navigating hostile environments, and he knew how to prepare for what was coming. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, Ethan began his work. Reinforcing the farm. The old barn was the first focus of Ethan's attention. He reinforced the doors with heavy steel brackets, making them nearly impossible to break down without machinery. Inside, he set up a series of tripwires connected to flares and smoke bombs, non-lethal deterrents designed to confuse and disorient intruders. The tools and equipment were secured in a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, a trick Ethan had learned during his time in the SEALs. Next, he moved to the perimeter of the farm. The fences, though weathered, were still sturdy enough to hold. Ethan fortified them with barbed wire and placed small traps in strategic locations, spiked caltrops hidden in the dirt, and motion-triggered lights to illuminate any movement during the night. It wasn't just about protecting the farm. It was about sending a message. If the Crimson Vipers wanted to bring the fight to him, they'd have to pay a price. Frank watched from the porch, his expression a mix of pride and worry. "You think this'll be enough?" he asked, his voice gruff. "It's a start," Ethan replied without breaking stride. "But it won't stop them. They'll test us, and when they do, we need to be ready." Frank nodded, though the weight of the situation was clear in his eyes. "Your mother would have hated this," he said quietly. "She always wanted this farm to be a place of peace." Ethan paused, his jaw tightening. "So do I. But peace isn't something you wait for. Sometimes you have to fight for it." The community rallies. By midday, word of Crimson's visit had spread through Birchwood, and it wasn't long before Cassie arrived with a group of locals. Tom Harris, Mr. Leary, and a few others stood in the yard, their faces set with grim determination. "We heard about last night," Cassie said, crossing her arms. "If they're coming for you, they're coming for all of us." Ethan stepped forward, surveying the group. "I appreciate the support, but this isn't just about me. If you're going to stand up to the Vipers, you need to be ready for what comes next." "We're tired of being scared," Tom said, his voice shaking but resolute. "We can't let them keep doing this." Ethan nodded. "All right, here's what we do." Over the next few hours, Ethan led the group in setting up defenses around the town. The diner, general store, and hardware shop became rallying points, each fortified with barriers and escape routes. He taught the group basic strategies, how to communicate under pressure, how to use their surroundings to their advantage, and most importantly, how to stay calm in the face of danger. Sophia Carter, one of the younger townsfolk, stepped forward. "What about weapons?" she asked, her voice steady. "They've got guns and numbers. We need more than fences and traps." Ethan hesitated. "Weapons can escalate things quickly," he said. "But you're right, we can't go unarmed. I'll handle that." The Crimson Viper's first move. As night fell, Ethan's preparations were put to the test. The low growl of motorcycle engines echoed through the darkness, growing louder as the Crimson Vipers approached the farm. Ethan stood on the porch, his rifle slung over his shoulder, while Frank watched from the safety of the house. The Vipers came in a formation of 10 bikes, their headlights cutting through the night like predatory eyes. Crimson, as always, led the pack. He dismounted with a swagger, his leather jacket catching the light of the full moon. "Evening, Blake," Crimson called, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "Heard you've been busy." Ethan didn't reply, his steely gaze fixed on the gang leader. Crimson smirked. "You know, this doesn't have to get ugly. Sell the farm, take the money, and we'll be on our way." Ethan stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Not for sale." Crimson's smirk faded, replaced by a cold sneer. "Suit yourself." With a signal from Crimson, 2 of the Vipers broke off, heading toward the barn. Ethan raised his hand, a sharp whistle cutting through the night. The tripwires triggered, sending flares shooting into the sky and bathing the area in blinding light. The bikers stumbled, disoriented, as smoke bombs erupted around them. The chaos gave Ethan the advantage. He moved swiftly, his training kicking in as he disarmed one of the bikers with a calculated strike to the wrist. The man fell, clutching his hand in pain, while the other retreated. Crimson's voice cut through the noise. "Enough," he barked, calling his gang back. His glare was venomous as he turned to Ethan. "You think you've won. This isn't over." Ethan's voice was steady as steel. "It's over when you leave this town for good." Crimson mounted his bike, his expression promising retribution. "Enjoy your little victory, Blake. We'll be back." As the gang retreated into the night, Ethan exhaled, his muscles still taut with adrenaline. The first strike had been a success, but he knew it was only the beginning. The Crimson Vipers would return, and next time, they wouldn't hold back. Crimson's counterattack. The morning after the Vipers' retreat, Birchwood buzzed with nervous energy. Word of Ethan Blake's stand against the gang had spread like wildfire, igniting both hope and fear in the townsfolk. While many were inspired by his courage, others worried about the inevitable retaliation. The Crimson Vipers were not known for their mercy, and Ethan's defiance had painted a target on not just him, but the entire community. Ethan spent the morning repairing the damage caused by the skirmish. The barn doors bore the marks of the bikers' attempted break-in, and the fences along the perimeter were trampled in spots. Frank joined him, his hand steady despite the tension that hung in the air. "You think they'll come back soon?" Frank asked, his voice low. "They will," Ethan replied, tightening a length of barbed wire. "But we'll be ready." The warning. Around midday, a black sedan rolled up the dusty road to the farm. The sleek, unfamiliar vehicle was a stark contrast to the rugged pickups and tractors common in Birchwood. Ethan stepped onto the porch, his instincts sharpening as the car came to a halt. A tall, thin man in a tailored suit stepped out, his movements calculated and deliberate. "Mr. Blake," the man greeted, his tone polite but cold. "My name is Silas Greylock. I represent the Crimson Vipers." Ethan crossed his arms. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here." Silas smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to deliver a message." Ethan's silence prompted Silas to continue. "Crimson is willing to let bygones be bygones if you agree to sell the farm. It's a generous offer, well above market value. You and your father could start fresh, somewhere far from this unpleasantness." Ethan's jaw tightened. "And if I say no?" Silas's smile faded, replaced by a steely expression. "Then you leave us no choice but to escalate. I'd advise you to consider your options carefully, Mr. Blake." Ethan took a step closer, his voice low and firm. "Tell Crimson this farm isn't for sale, and if he tries to take it by force, he'll regret it." Silas regarded him for a moment, then nodded curtly. "Very well. You've made your choice." The sedan disappeared down the road, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a sense of foreboding. Ethan knew the gang's next move wouldn't be a negotiation. A town divided. As the day wore on, Ethan met with Cassie and the small group of resistors in the diner's back room. The tension in the air was palpable as they discussed their options. "We've got to take the fight to them," Sophia said, her fiery determination evident. "If we wait, they'll just pick us off one by one." Ethan shook his head. "We don't have the numbers or the firepower to confront them directly. Our best chance is to outthink them." Tom Harris, still visibly shaken from the previous night, spoke up. "But what about the rest of the town? Most people just want to keep their heads down and avoid trouble." Cassie sighed. "We need them to see that standing together is the only way to break the Vipers' hold. Fear is their weapon, but unity is ours." Ethan nodded. "We'll need to act fast. Crimson won't wait long to make his move." The night of the raid. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the quiet of the farm was broken by the distant rumble of engines. Ethan had anticipated this, and the traps he'd set around the property were primed and ready. The Vipers approached in force, their headlights casting eerie beams across the landscape. Crimson led the charge, his bike roaring like a beast unleashed. Behind him, his crew spread out, their numbers larger than before. Clearly, Crimson was done playing games. Ethan stood on the porch, his rifle at the ready. Beside him, Frank held a shotgun, his hand steady despite the danger. "Stay inside," Ethan said firmly, glancing at his father. Frank's gaze was resolute. Not a chance. This is my farm too. Ethan didn't argue. They had a plan, and every hand mattered. As the bikers reached the perimeter, the first trap was triggered. A concealed spike strip shredded their tires, sending several bikes skidding to a halt. Chaos erupted as smoke bombs detonated, filling the air with thick plumes that disoriented the attackers. Ethan moved swiftly, using the confusion to his advantage. From his vantage point on the porch, he fired warning shots into the air, forcing the bikers to scatter. Crimson, however, was undeterred. He dismounted, his eyes blazing with fury as he advanced toward the house. "Blake!" Crimson shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You think this changes anything? You've just made it worse for yourself." Ethan's response was cold and measured. "You brought this on yourself. Leave, or face the consequences." Crimson laughed darkly. "You don't scare me." As the bikers regrouped, they began their assault in earnest. Several charged toward the barn, attempting to break through its reinforced doors. Inside, a secondary trap was triggered. Tripwires activated a series of bright flares, forcing the intruders to retreat. Meanwhile, Sophia and a few other townsfolk emerged from the tree line, rifles and shotguns at the ready. Their surprise counterattack caught the Vipers off guard, forcing them to split their focus. Ethan descended from the porch, moving with precision and purpose. He confronted Crimson directly, the two men locking eyes in a standoff that felt like the culmination of years of tension. "This is your last chance," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Call off your gang and leave Birchwood." Crimson sneered. "You think you're some kind of hero. This town belongs to me." Ethan's response was swift, a calculated strike that disarmed Crimson and left him sprawled in the dirt. The gang leader's bravado crumbled as he realized he had underestimated his opponent. A community united. As the Vipers retreated under the cover of darkness, the townsfolk began to emerge from their hiding places. The sight of the gang fleeing sparked a wave of relief and hope that rippled through Birchwood. For the first time in years, the people saw that resistance was possible. Ethan, bruised but unbroken, stood among them, his expression resolute. "This isn't over," he said. "But tonight, we showed them what happens when we stand together." The crowd murmured in agreement, their fear slowly giving way to determination. Cassie stepped forward, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You've given this town something we haven't had in a long time. Courage." Ethan nodded, though he knew the battle was far from won. Crimson would return, and the stakes would only grow higher. But for now, the farm stood, and so did the spirit of Birchwood. The storm breaks. Ethan stood at the edge of the field, the morning sun casting long shadows over the land. The air was heavy, as if the earth itself could sense the impending storm. He adjusted his grip on the shovel, finishing the last of the trenches around the farm's perimeter. They weren't deep enough to stop vehicles, but they would slow down anyone foolish enough to approach on foot. Frank emerged from the barn, his face grim. "Radio says there's a big storm coming in tonight. Might wash out the lower fields." Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes scanning the horizon. "The storm we need to worry about isn't coming from the sky." Frank's expression darkened. "You think they'll strike tonight?" Ethan nodded. Crimson's pride won't let him wait. He'll want to hit back hard and fast. The preparations around the farm were nearly complete. The remaining buildings were fortified, escape routes planned, and traps carefully concealed. Ethan had walked the perimeter so many times he could navigate it blindfolded. Still, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. This wasn't just about protecting the farm. It was about protecting his father, his friends, and the community that had started to rally behind him. The warning shot. Around midday, a lone biker appeared on the dirt road leading to the farm. Ethan recognized him as one of Crimson's lackeys, a wiry man with a cocky smirk permanently etched on his face. The man stopped his bike just short of the main gate, revving the engine obnoxiously. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He didn't raise it. Yet. "Message from Crimson," the biker shouted, his voice carrying over the rumble of the engine. "You've got until sunset to pack up and leave. After that, we're not holding back." Ethan's expression didn't change. He walked down the steps, stopping a few yards from the gate. "Tell Crimson we'll be here waiting." The biker laughed, shaking his head. "You're as stupid as you're stubborn, Blake. You're gonna regret this." Ethan's voice was calm but cold. "The only regret you'll have is coming back." The biker revved his engine one last time before speeding off, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Ethan turned back to the house, his resolve hardening. They were running out of time. A town on edge. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Ethan drove into Birchwood for what he hoped wouldn't be his last visit before the fight. The diner was unusually quiet, its usual patrons absent. Cassie was behind the counter, cleaning with a nervous energy. "They sent another message," Ethan said as he approached. "They're coming at sunset." Cassie set down the cloth, her face pale. "What do we do?" "We stick to the plan," Ethan replied. "The farm's fortified. If we can hold them off there, we'll buy the town more time to organize." Cassie hesitated. "Ethan, what if they don't stop with the farm? What if they come after the rest of us?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's why we have to stop them now." Tom Harris and Mr. Leary joined them, their faces lined with worry. "We'll be ready," Tom said, his voice trembling. "Whatever you need, we'll do it." Ethan nodded. "Spread the word. Anyone willing to help, send them to the farm. Anyone else, tell them to stay out of sight." The final preparations. Back at the farm, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Frank loaded shells into his old shotgun, his movements slow but deliberate. Sophia arrived with a group of younger townsfolk, all carrying hunting rifles or makeshift weapons. "This is what we've got," Sophia said, gesturing to the group. "Not much, but we're here." Ethan surveyed the group, his expression serious. "Stick to your positions. Use the traps and barriers. Don't engage unless you have to. This isn't about being heroes. It's about surviving." The hours ticked by as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. Ethan paced the porch, his mind racing through every contingency. He knew the Vipers would come in force, and while the farm was fortified, it wasn't impenetrable. The odds were stacked against them, but retreat wasn't an option. The assault begins. Just as the last light of day faded, the sound of engines filled the air. The roar was louder than before. Crimson had brought nearly 24 riders this time, their headlights cutting through the darkness like predators' eyes. Ethan stood on the porch, his rifle in hand. Frank and Sophia were stationed at the barn, while the rest of the defenders took cover along the tree line and behind makeshift barricades. The plan was simple: delay the Vipers long enough to force a retreat or until help could arrive. Crimson dismounted first, his movements slow and deliberate. He surveyed the farm with a predatory smile. "Evening, Blake," he called, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Nice setup you've got here. Shame it's all going to waste." Ethan didn't respond, his eyes locked on the gang leader. Crimson raised a hand, and the Vipers surged forward. The first wave hit the perimeter, triggering the traps Ethan had set. Spiked caltrots shredded tires, sending bikes skidding into ditches. Tripwires activated flares, disorienting the attackers and lighting up the battlefield. Ethan took aim, firing warning shots that forced the bikers to scatter. Sophia and her group picked off targets from the tree line, their rifles cracking through the night. But the Vipers weren't deterred. They regrouped quickly, using their numbers to overwhelm the defenders. Several broke through the barricades, advancing toward the house. A fight for survival. Ethan moved like a shadow, his training as a SEAL guiding his every step. He took down one intruder with a swift blow to the knee, disarming him before moving to the next. Sophia held her ground at the barn, picking off attackers with deadly precision. Frank, despite his age, proved to be a formidable force. He held the back entrance of the house, his shotgun booming as he drove back two bikers trying to break in. Crimson, however, remained the biggest threat. He pushed through the chaos, his eyes locked on Ethan. "This ends tonight," he shouted, raising a crowbar as he charged. Ethan met him head-on, their clash a brutal exchange of blows. Crimson's strength was formidable, but Ethan's precision and discipline gave him the edge. He blocked a wild swing, countering with a strike that sent Crimson staggering. "Give up, Crimson," Ethan said, his voice steady. "You've already lost." Crimson's sneer twisted into a snarl. Not yet. Before he could launch another attack, the sound of sirens cut through the night. The sheriff's cruisers appeared on the horizon, their red and blue lights piercing the darkness. Crimson hesitated, his gang already retreating under the pressure of the defenders and the approaching law enforcement. With a final glare at Ethan, he turned and fled into the night, his gang following close behind. Aftermath. The farm was eerily quiet in the aftermath of the battle. Smoke hung in the air, and the once pristine fields bore the scars of the fight. Ethan stood on the porch, his rifle still in hand, as the sheriff approached. "Hell of a mess," Sheriff Callahan said, his tone a mix of admiration and concern. "You held them off." Ethan nodded, his exhaustion evident. "For now." Callahan's gaze hardened. "We'll take it from here. You've done enough." As the sheriff and his deputies began their work, Ethan turned to the small group of defenders who had stood by him. "You did good," he said, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "But this isn't over. We need to stay ready." Sophia stepped forward, her face bruised but determined. "We're with you, Ethan. Whatever comes next, we'll be ready." Ethan nodded, his resolve unshaken. The Crimson Vipers had been dealt a blow, but the fight for Birchwood was far from over. The final stand. The day after the Crimson Vipers' retreat was unusually quiet. The air hung heavy with tension, as if the land itself was bracing for what was to come. Ethan Blake stood at the edge of the farm, surveying the wreckage left behind. The burned-out shells of motorcycles littered the field, and the once pristine barn bore the scars of battle. Though they had won the night, the war was far from over. Sheriff Callahan and his deputies had managed to apprehend a few of the gang members, but Crimson himself had escaped into the night with most of his crew. It was a hollow victory, one that Ethan knew would only serve to fuel the gang leader's rage. Crimson wouldn't just retaliate, he would escalate. As the sun rose higher, Ethan gathered the defenders who had stood with him. Frank, Sophia, Cassie, Tom Harris, and a handful of others sat in a circle on the porch, their faces a mix of exhaustion and determination. "They'll be back," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the fatigue weighing on him. "And next time, they'll come with everything they have. We need to be ready." Strength in unity. Sophia was the first to speak. "What's the plan, Ethan? We can't keep holding them off forever." "We don't have to," Ethan replied, his gaze sweeping over the group. "We just need to hold long enough to break them." Crimson relies on fear and loyalty to keep his crew in line. If we show them they can't win here, his gang will start to fracture. Cassie nodded. "People are starting to see that they don't have to be afraid. We got more support now than we did yesterday." Ethan glanced at her. "Good. Spread the word. Anyone willing to fight, send them here. Anyone else, tell them to stay out of sight. This is going to get worse before it gets better." Preparing for the endgame. The rest of the day was spent fortifying the farm and laying new traps. Ethan worked tirelessly, his years of military training guiding every decision. He dug deeper trenches, reinforced barricades, and set up a network of motion-activated alarms using salvaged parts from the hardware store. Sophia took charge of training the defenders, teaching them how to handle weapons and coordinate their movements. Though most of the group were farmers and shopkeepers, their determination was undeniable. They were tired of living in fear, and under Ethan's leadership, they found a new sense of purpose. As night fell, Ethan stood on the porch, staring into the darkness. The farm was as ready as it could be, but the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't just fighting for his home. He was fighting for the soul of Birchwood. The Crimson Viper's return. The attack came just before midnight. The low growl of motorcycle engines broke the silence, growing louder as the Crimson Vipers approached. This time, there were no warning shots, no posturing. Crimson had brought his entire crew, and they came with one goal: total destruction. The first wave hit the outer perimeter, triggering the traps Ethan had laid. Spiked caltrops punctured tires, sending bikes skidding into the dirt. Smoke bombs erupted, creating a chaotic battlefield that disoriented the attackers. But the Vipers pressed on, their numbers overwhelming the defenders' defenses. Ethan moved with precision, his rifle cracking through the night as he targeted the bikers trying to breach the house. Beside him, Frank held his shotgun steady, driving back anyone who got too close. At the barn, Sophia and her group held their ground, using the elevated loft as a vantage point. The defenders' coordinated efforts kept the Vipers at bay, but it was clear that the gang had come prepared. Several of them carried bolt cutters and crowbars, tearing through the barriers with brute force. Crimson's push. In the chaos, Crimson emerged like a specter, his presence commanding attention. He barked orders to his crew, rallying them as they began to encircle the farm. With a crowbar in one hand and a pistol in the other, he cut through the defenses with ruthless efficiency. Ethan spotted him near the barn and moved to intercept. The two men clashed in a brutal exchange of blows, their fight a microcosm of the larger battle raging around them. Crimson's strength was formidable, but Ethan's training and discipline gave him the edge. "You should have stayed down, Blake," Crimson snarled, swinging the crowbar in a wide arc. Ethan dodged, countering with a strike that sent the weapon clattering to the ground. "This ends here, Crimson," he said, his voice cold. The gang leader lunged, tackling Ethan to the ground. The two men grappled, their struggle lit by the flickering flames of the barn, which had been set alight by a stray Molotov cocktail. Ethan managed to break free, delivering a devastating blow that left Crimson gasping for air. The turning point. As the barn burned, the tide of the battle began to shift. The defenders, bolstered by their resolve and Ethan's leadership, pushed back against the Vipers with renewed vigor. One by one, the gang members began to falter, their loyalty to Crimson wavering in the face of mounting losses. Sophia, from her position in the loft, spotted the moment the Vipers' morale began to crack. "They're breaking," she shouted, rallying the defenders. "Keep pushing." Ethan capitalized on the momentum, coordinating a final charge that drove the remaining bikers into retreat. Crimson, bloodied and beaten, staggered to his feet, his gaze filled with hatred as he called for his crew to fall back. "This isn't over, Blake," he shouted as he mounted his bike. "You'll regret this." Ethan watched as the gang leader disappeared into the night, his crew scattered and broken. For the first time, the farm was silent. Aftermath. The morning sun revealed the full extent of the damage. The barn was a smoldering ruin, and the fields bore the scars of the battle. But the defenders stood together, their faces marked by exhaustion, but also by a sense of triumph. Sheriff Callahan arrived with reinforcements, his expression grim as he surveyed the scene. "Looks like you held your ground," he said to Ethan. "We did," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "But it's not over. Crimson's still out there." Callahan nodded. "We'll track him down. You've done more for this town than anyone could have asked, Blake. You've given us a chance to take our home back." As the sheriff's team began their work, Ethan turned to the group of defenders. "This was just the beginning," he said. "We've shown them what we're capable of, but we can't let our guard down." Cassie stepped forward, her voice filled with determination. "We won't. We've got you to thank for that." Ethan nodded, though the weight of what lay ahead was clear in his eyes. The battle for Birchwood wasn't over, but the community had found its strength. Together, they would face whatever came next. and Ethan, for the first time in years, felt a sense of purpose that couldn't be shaken. The final reckoning. The farm had survived, but the cost was steep. The barn was reduced to embers, and the fields were scared by the chaos of battle. Ethan stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving from exertion. The defenders gathered around him, their faces marked by dirt, sweat, and quiet pride. The Crimson Vipers had been driven off, but Ethan knew the fight wasn't truly over. Sophia approached, her rifle slung over her shoulder. "We've pushed them back, but Crimson won't stop. He's too proud to let this go." Ethan nodded, his expression grim. "You're right. He'll regroup and come back stronger. If we want to end this, we have to take the fight to him." A plan of action. The defenders regrouped in the farmhouse, where Ethan laid out the plan. Crimson's pride is his weakness. He doesn't just want to win. He wants to crush anyone who challenges him. That makes him predictable. We'll use that against him. Hassie leaned forward. "How do we find him?" "He won't be hiding in plain sight." Ethan turned to Sheriff Callahan, who had joined them after the initial battle. "Any idea where Crimson might regroup?" The sheriff nodded. "There's an old warehouse on the edge of town. The Vipers have been using it as their base of operations. It's where they keep their bikes and weapons." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's where we'll finish this." The warehouse assault. Under the cover of darkness, Ethan led a small team of defenders to the warehouse. Sheriff Callahan and his deputies provided backup, ensuring that the group wouldn't be outnumbered. The plan was simple: strike fast, neutralize the gang's resources, and capture Crimson if possible. As they approached the warehouse, the group moved silently through the shadows. Ethan took point, his movements precise and deliberate. The building loomed ahead, its broken windows glowing faintly from the light within. The sound of voices and laughter drifted out into the night, signaling that the Vipers were unaware of the impending attack. Ethan motioned for the group to spread out, positioning themselves at key entry points. When everyone was in place, he gave the signal. A loud bang shattered the quiet as the defenders breached the doors, flooding the warehouse with chaos. The Vipers scrambled to respond, but the surprise and coordination of the defenders left them disoriented. Sheriff Callahan's deputies secured the perimeter, cutting off any escape routes. Inside, Ethan and Sophia led the charge, moving with precision as they disarmed and subdued the gang members. Crimson emerged from a back room, his face twisted with fury. "Blake," he roared, his voice echoing through the warehouse. "You've got some nerve coming here." Ethan stepped forward, his rifle leveled at the gang leader. "It's over, Crimson. Surrender, and this ends here." Crimson laughed bitterly, drawing a knife. "I don't surrender to anyone." The two men clashed in a brutal hand-to-hand fight, their movements fierce and unrelenting. Crimson's strength was matched by Ethan's discipline and training. The fight was intense, but Ethan's experience gave him the edge. With a calculated move, he disarmed Crimson and pinned him to the ground. "Enough." Ethan growled, his voice firm. "It's over." Crimson struggled for a moment before finally going still, his face a mask of defeat. The end of the Vipers. With Crimson in custody and the rest of the gang subdued, the warehouse fell silent. Sheriff Callahan moved in, placing handcuffs on Crimson and securing the gang's weapons. "Good work," the sheriff said to Ethan. "We'll make sure he doesn't see daylight for a long time." Ethan nodded, his body heavy with exhaustion but his mind sharp. "This town deserves peace. Make sure it stays that way." As the deputies loaded the gang members into their cruisers, the defenders began to disperse. Sophia approached Ethan, a faint smile on her face. "You did it," she said. "We all did." Ethan looked at her, his expression softening. "This wasn't just about me. The town stood together. That's what matters." Epilogue. A new beginning. In the weeks that followed, Birchwood began to heal. The Crimson Vipers were dismantled, their grip on the town broken. Businesses reopened without fear, and the sense of community that had been eroded by years of intimidation was slowly restored. Ethan spent his days rebuilding the farm, with Frank by his side. Though the scars of the battle remained, the land began to flourish once more. Cassie's diner became a hub for the town's renewed spirit, and Sophia continued to inspire others with her courage and resilience. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, Ethan stood at the edge of the farm, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Frank joined him, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. "You've done good, Ethan," Frank said. "Your mother would be proud." Ethan nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "It's not just me. The town fought back. That's what she would have wanted." As the first stars appeared in the sky, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The fight was over, and for the first time, Birchwood was truly free. Ethan knew there would always be challenges ahead, but he also knew the strength of the community he called home. Together, they would face whatever came next, and together, they would endure.